and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, as the dust settles on Singapore's 13th general election, let's evaluate the underlying trends and new dynamics that the results have revealed. Joining us on the show tonight, we have Bridget Welsh, who is with the Asia Research Institute at University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Welcome to the show, Bridget. It's always good to have you here, and welcome back. Okay, so I do want to ask you about what's been recent narratives coming out from the election. So the ruling PAP, People's Action Party, has seen recently more and more critical interpretations of the general election results, yours included in a recent piece which highlighted some strategic campaign missteps. Now, judging on what's been written lately, Bridget, where do you and others differ from PAP's preferred narrative?
Well, I think, most people in Singapore recognize that a 9% drop in a popular vote is actually not normal for Singapore elections, as well as a loss of a GRC, which is a group representation constituency. And I think this is significant in terms of the losses. And I think their emphasis is to make that less significant, to point out that the fact that they did win over 90% of the seats, that they won 61% of the popular vote. And they're focusing on the glass half full, while others are looking at the glass half empty, or at least not so much the empty part, but there's a recognition that there are gaps in that glass that need to be drawn to attention to.
Bridget, to what extent is this a consequence of the PAP itself upping the ante on its performance? Always, presuming that they will do much better than, at least in this case, they've done, that they have the upper hand, the superior political organization in Singapore, that in some ways, there's no real reason to, in fact, have a federal to have an opposition. Do you think they are partly to blame for this kind of deficit analysis, that something's gone wrong rather than gone right for them?
I think there are a couple things going on here. First of all, I think they do set an unrealistic standard. I think in any other context, if they would appreciate that potentially some losses are actually acceptable and normal, they would actually have a much different type of reaction. But I think we have to ask ourselves why they have this type of reaction. And it's partly because of two things. Number one, they don't see the need for alternative voices. They don't see the need for an opposition. They think they are the answer. And as a consequence, that has actually colored their views. And the second thing that's going on is that they do want to be in full control. And this is something deeply rooted within the PAP. And I think that giving up that control has been something that is very hard for the PAP. And it's hard for all systems that are used to being one dominant party systems to give up power. And I think we're clearly seeing a resistance to that.
And on that note, I do want to ask you about the youth vote, because that seems to be where the desire for differing voices lie. Talk to us about the importance of young and minority voters in this election, because when Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong was asked whether PAP had lost the youth vote, he said, to quote him, "Young people have significantly different life aspirations and priorities." So he recognizes that there are differences, but what are they doing to kind of acknowledge that this is a conversation that's being had?
I think we have to understand that it's a good thing that there's a recognition that there are differences within Singapore, and I think that is a very positive step. But if we look at the history of Singapore elections, in the last three elections, 2011, 2015, and 2020, we see that the youth vote has been one of the groups that have swung. They swung in 2011, they swung back to the PAP with the kind of nationalist narrative, Lee Kuan Yew's passing in 2015, and they swung back in this election. So in a sense, it's not just people under the ages of 20 and to 25 to 21, which is the ages that we've seen the most swing on initial polling results suggest, but it's also really anywhere from the ages of 35 and below. And it has been a pattern. And now there are also other swing voters that we look at when we analyzed Singapore. One has been the issue of minorities, issues of Malay community and the Indian community, and they have swung in different elections. For example, in 1991, the Malay community was very important in that election. And we can see that there were a lot of issues about the sensitive issues of race in this campaign. And they had been happening before the campaign, the presidency, issues associated with brown face ads and others. And so this is a community we do see some movement in that context. Some other studies also point to the traditional PAP voters that have moved away from the party. This is the support for PSP in this context. I also look at the elderly community in terms of that were a swing in 2011, and I think that they will be very important in this election because this was a pandemic election. They stood in very long lines during the election.
And they're higher risk
as well. Yes, and they were high. And so I think that there are going to be more analyses that come. So it's not just about young people. It's about specific groups within the context of Singapore. And the PAP also has its base, such as new citizens, such as particular traditional supporters. So we look at that analytically to analyze how those moves are changing.
Right. Bridget, sorry to interrupt, but very quickly, I mean, in terms of the PAP's own demeanor, its own outlook, and in fact, the age profile of the PAP, it's reasonably young, and it seems to be a party that does put it, unlike many authoritarian long-term parties in the region that are gerontocracies, you know, lots of old people. This is actually relatively young, and Ting Pei Ling, the Kate Spade candidate of the PAP from many electoral cycles ago, she did very well.
Yes.
So does the PAP recognize that it's the young face is necessary?
There are two things here. First of all, the election was about the fourth generation of leaders. All right. In fact, Lee Hsien Loong was speaking about resigning and stepping down, retiring in 2 years. He's in his late 60s now, and so I think that
Relatively young by Malaysian standards.
Extremely young by anybody's standards, and he's still very young. Many people are still young at heart as well, including himself. So I would say that what we see is a situation where it was about bringing in younger leaders, and also they had a lot of young candidates. But some of those young candidates didn't have the same appeal as the opposition. And I think they didn't have the same way of engaging the opposition, the electorate in a way that was creating the sense of charisma, the sense of excitement, which really worked to the advantage of Workers' Party. So I think that it's not that the party is young, it's also whether or not it's engaging the young in a particular way, and also it's whether or not it's changing how it's engaging. And I think this is what did not happen in this election in a way that actually created a momentum for PAP's favor, and it worked for the opposition.
All right, fascinating, and there's a lot more to unpack there. We're going to take a quick break, but we're going to come back and continue our look at the results of Singapore's elections. Stay tuned to Consider This. Hi, if you've just joined us, you're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. In the studio with us tonight is Bridget Welsh of the Asia Research Institute at University of Nottingham, Malaysia. And joining us via Skype now from Hong Kong is Donald Lau, Professor of Practice in Public Policy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Good evening, Donald. Welcome to the show. I understand that you're joining us via phone now. Okay, if I may ask my first question, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong had noted that the PAP's vote share of 61% was, quote-unquote, a clear mandate, but was lower than what he had hoped for. Donald, what's your analysis of what led to a reduced level of support for PAP in the recent elections?
Yeah, I think, thanks for having me on the show. I think the Prime Minister summed it up very well. I think going into this election, which was held in the middle of a pandemic, most observers, in fact, every observer I knew, predicted a large win for the PAP and possibly a wipeout of the opposition. And this is because in past elections that were held in crises, the PAP has always done very well. And of course, the explanation that was given is that that there was going to be a flight to safety, and then the PAP represented reliability, predictability. So I think the reduced vote share and also the loss of another GRC, another group constituency to the Workers' Party came as a shock, not just to the ruling party, but to most observers and analysts. As for the reasons, I think, obviously we need a lot more data and analysis, but already we hear that, and the ruling party has also acknowledged that the youth vote in this instance was particularly important. That Prime Minister Lee acknowledged that young people, young Singaporeans have a different perspective on how race issues should be discussed and how those new perspectives need to be accommodated. So I think that's one dimension of it.
Donald, if I could stop you there. Donald, this is Sharaad speaking. The question, of the PAP being blindsided, perhaps because of their sense of their own mission or their accomplishments. But when observers are equally blindsided, it really is a reason to pause and think, why is it, do you think, that so many people did not see what was happening on the ground?
Well, partly because no opinion polling is done during the election period. And also because of the pandemic, really, there are no experts here, right? There's such an unusual context in which these elections were being held that it is hard for anybody to say with any degree of confidence or certainty how the elections would turn out. I think also, this is my own perspective, I think most people generally felt that the PAP could be counted on to manage the pandemic eventually, and that because they had confidence in the PAP's handling of the pandemic and the challenges and the economic challenges it created, that paradoxically gave people more confidence, almost as it were, to vote for something more, right? And to vote for accountability, to vote for fairness, to vote for more representation and diversity in Parliament. So I think I see that as a very good sign, because clearly a significant segment of the voters are saying we want more than just a safe pair of hands or economic recovery. We also want fairness, voice, accountability, and diversity in Parliament.
Donald, what about Singaporean society? Help us understand the levels of inequality that have a political import, that actually leads to changes in political behavior in Singapore.
Yeah, I think that's a good lens to approach the issue, the lens of inequality. And traditionally, observers, including myself, when we talk about inequality, we tend to refer to inequality among residents, among Singaporean citizens and permanent residents. What has been a blind side for everyone, not just the ruling party, but even for most researchers and commentators, has been inequality between the resident population and Singapore's very large migrant worker population of more than 1 million. And a significant proportion of that migrant worker population live in these cramped, crowded foreign worker dormitories. And of course, with the pandemic, that's the population that's been most adversely affected. And so what the pandemic has revealed is this kind of inequality, health inequality, housing inequality, spatial inequality between the resident population and the migrant worker population.
But do Singaporeans care, Donald? Sorry, Donald, do Singaporeans care what happens to foreigners? And foreigners don't vote.
Yes. So this is indeed a blind side, right? I mean, I said earlier it's a blind side for the government, partly because foreigners don't vote. And also a significant proportion of Singaporeans, I'm afraid, say, do not welcome, they welcome the labor and the cheap services that these migrant workers bring, but they don't really welcome them in the community. And that is one of the reasons why politically the only acceptable thing to do is to pack them in these dormitories and put them at the edges, at the peripheries of these housing estates. Okay. You have a bit of that challenge also in Malaysia with your large migrant worker population. But I think what this pandemic has shown is that, we can't be safe until everyone is safe.
Right.
And I think to the PAP government's credit, they have said that after the pandemic, we will have to relook housing and how we accommodate, how we house foreign workers. And they have also tried to prime the population, to prepare the population that we have to accept.
Donald, where do you think Singapore is going to go next? How is the PAP government going to respond to this drop in the popular vote?
That's the $64 million question, isn't it? My sense is the PAP needs to engage in not just soul searching, but some acknowledgement that Singaporeans want a fairer political system. This election is very different from 2011. Even though the vote share, the PAP's vote share seems very similar. In 2011, the swing against the PAP was mostly as a result of discontent over what we call bread and butter issues: housing affordability, congestion in the public transport system, a sense of congestion due to too many foreign workers. I think how this election differs from that is that it's far more than just bread and butter issues. It is about fairness in the political system, the sense that we need more voices, we need more diversity to deal with the challenges that a pandemic-disrupted world would generate for Singapore. So I think in that sense, the PAP government will need to look beyond how do we bring about economic recovery, how do we meet the basic needs of the housing or whatever needs of Singaporeans, to also look into issues of procedural fairness, democratic legitimacy, accountability.
Right. Donald, Donald, the acknowledgement of Pritam Singh from the Workers' Party as the leader of the opposition, are you surprised by that move? Do you think it's a move in the right direction in terms of what you just said?
Yeah, it's a surprising move. I didn't even know it was on the card. Yeah, it's a surprising move. I think at least from what we know, I think it's a step in the right direction. The sense that the system needs to be fairer for the opposition. That they also should have access to resources of the state, and I think it's a step in the right direction in terms of creating a more level playing field politically.
All right, Donald, great insights. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. We're going to take another quick break. Stay tuned to consider this. Thanks so much for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation with Bridget Welsh, who's in the studio with us. She is with the Asia Research Institute at University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Bridget, interesting insights from Donald there. I'm going to give you a chance to respond, but I do want to bring it back home to Malaysia, closer to home. Rumours are rife, of course, that an early general election could be called. Are there lessons that Malaysian politicians should take note of looking at the Singapore example?
I think there are two. The first of which is that campaigns do matter. I think one of the things that happened in Singapore is that the campaign took on a momentum, and that worked in the favor of the opposition. And I think the second one is do not assume that the handling of a pandemic will lead you to a positive result. And I think that, in fairness, Singapore did a very good job, with obviously the issues of foreign workers as an exception. But I would say that generally it's been ahead of the game and proactive. And I think Malaysia as well. Malaysia has a lot of international kudos for its and praise for its performance in terms of a pandemic. But that doesn't necessarily translate to the same way in an election in this context. And I think that's an important lesson in this area. And I think one of the areas where I differ from Donald is that I do think that while the campaign did not focus on economic issues to the same degree as it did in 2011 or even in 2015, I think the economy is still a very important issue. And it is particularly an important issue as the pandemic moves away from issues of health to the issues of livelihoods and sustainability. And I think this is Malaysia's real challenge, as well is now to get the economy going. And this translates into issues in the campaigns.
Yeah. So, Bridget, it's interesting because in the Singaporean case, we have this long-standing government, the only government they've had since independence, and they have high levels of performance, right? In terms of the performance index, they've delivered for Singaporeans. So you'd think that, logically, they would go back to the PAP as this safe haven, right? I mean, how do we translate that into a Malaysian story? What is the safe, if that's the logic, what is the safe haven in Malaysia? And is that where Malaysians are now? I mean, is that what Malaysians want? If Singaporeans suddenly want representation, the height of a crisis, and not the steady hand of the PAP, what can we draw from that?
Well, I think there in the context of Malaysia, the safe haven would be the Barisan Nasional. Right, of the past, not the current government, which has only been around for a few months. It hasn't really been able to establish itself a very long period of time. So in a sense, the PN is actually at a disadvantage if this argument is a flight to safety.
Something you said earlier in our conversation about the youth vote, about minorities being kind of a swing vote, and the elderly as well. It got me thinking about the Malaysian context, especially this kind of disenchantment that youth seem to be projecting, especially on social media and the conversations there, towards the lack of acknowledgement of the issues that they're facing. Do you see similarities between conversations of youth and the kind of disenchantment of Singaporean youth with what's happening in Malaysia?
Yes. First of all, in Singapore, the youth are only about a third of the electorate in this context. In Malaysia, they're half of the electorate. And every election that becomes a new election because of the power of young people, new voters that come in, especially given the fact that Malaysia's elections are much more competitive than that of Singapore. But I would say that comparatively speaking, that the focus, because of what's happening in issues of unemployment, issues I think the focus among young people, at least in terms of the polling that is done here, is much more on bread and butter issues, on the economic side. It doesn't discount the fact that there are aspirational elements as well. But keep in mind, Malaysia has a different history. It has a history of actually the opposition winning power, which we do not have in the context of Singapore. In fact, the opposition is only able, at maximum recently, to win 10 seats out of 93. So I think that it's a different context from the perspective that there's much more openness in Malaysia.
I do want to ask you, and it's a question actually for the region, which is how authoritarian governments in the region learn, or don't learn, as it were. Can they self-correct? Is Singapore, lots of smart people in the PAP, and yet they seem to stumble over themselves when trying to respond to the ground. Do you see changes in terms of authoritarian governments, political parties in the region? Can we draw something from that?
Well, I think we have a situation where parties that have been in power for a long time don't see their problems. And I think we saw this in the context of Malaysia and UMNO. And the question now is, how has the party learned the right lessons from its electoral loss in 2018? Or will it actually go back and bring in the older leaders of the past? Or will it allow a regeneration, a rebranding? And I think so far the indications are not so clear that they're learning reforms. And I think one of the challenges that the PAP in Singapore is that they still haven't learned the same issues of reform. And that, in fact, much of what I believe in this election was self-inflicted losses on themselves, in the sense of how they responded to opposition. They overreacted. If they had been more magnanimous, more gentle, responding to some of the issues, they probably would have maintained their majority the way it was.
So, Bridget, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Donald a bit earlier. Where do you think Singapore is going next?
Well, I really feel that Singapore is at one of the most difficult crossroads in its history. The other time that I put a comparison to is in 1965, when it was separated from Malaysia. And I think as a consequence of that, you have to change its economic model and its political model, and they're linked. Because now we're in an era of deglobalization. Singapore's success came from riding globalization, right? And now it has to change. And this is a very difficult thing to do, especially when you're so used to things in a particular pattern.
Right. Okay, well, that's all the time we have, Bridget. Thank you so much for coming on the show and helping us think through this very complex issue of analysis for Singapore's political landscape. That's all the time we have on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night. Thanks, Bridget.
Thank you.